In this lesson, we're going to practice some of the tools that we learned in the Blender basics by creating this Sci-Fi crate. It's not too complicated and should give us a good warm-up for diving back into modeling. As with modeling any object, we're going to start out with the larger shapes and work our way down to the smaller details. Luckily, the overall shape is already a cube, so let's just start with our default cube. So the first task is really to separate out all the panels and make those panel cuts. For that, I'll select my cube and hit Tab to go into edit mode. To add a cut, I'll just hit Ctrl-R, hover my mouse over an edge that I want to cut through, left-click to place the cut, and then move my mouse up or down to slide it along that edge. I'll move this one up a bit, and then left-click to confirm. Let's do that one more time to define the panel that wraps all the way around. So I'll hit Ctrl-R, left-click to confirm the number of loops, and then move my mouse to slide it up a bit, and left-click to confirm. Now I want to section off these top corners as little cubes in and of themselves. So I want to create new loop cuts, just like this. But if I were to do that now, I'm going to have to do it individually on all four corners. And every time I make a change to one, I'm going to have to do that same thing to the others, and that's just a bit of a waste of time. So I'll hit Ctrl-Z to undo that, and instead we're going to use the mirror modifier so that we only have to do all of this work one time. Since we're going to be mirroring the front right corner to all of the other corners, let's go ahead and delete the rest of the geometry that we don't need. To do that, we need to place cuts right down the middle. So I'll hit Ctrl-R and hover my mouse over the top horizontal line, and left-click again to confirm without moving it at all. Then I'll do the same thing on this left side here, Ctrl-R, left-click to confirm, and then even if you do move it accidentally, you can also hit the Escape key, which cancels the movement, but not the loop cut itself. Then we can go into Top View, switch over to Wireframe View, and then box select the back vertices, and then shift left-click and drag to box select the left vertices, and just hit Delete and Vertices. Make sure to keep those center vertices where they are, and now if we switch back over to Solid View, we can see that we just have one single corner. If we go to the Modifiers tab in the Properties Editor, which is represented by a wrench icon, then we can go to Add Modifier, over to the Generate section, and down to the Mirror Modifier. Now it's copied and flipped our geometry from the positive x-axis to the negative side of the x-axis, but I'll also turn on the y-axis as well, so that we get all four corners. Now remember from the Blender basics that this modifier and a lot of other modifiers are based around the object origin, which is the orange dot right there in the center. So if things aren't lining up correctly when you're using the mirror modifier, it's probably because it's a little bit offset from wherever the geometry is. And if we wanted to set our object origin, then all we need to do is select some geometry. In this case, I'll just move it to the bottom here, and then snap our cursor to that vertex. So let's go to Mesh, Snap, and Cursor to Selected. And then I'll go to Object Mode by hitting Tab, and then go to Object, Set Origin, and Origin to 3D Cursor. Now, we don't really have to worry about moving the origin since it's just a cube here and it was already right in the center of the object, but this just makes it slightly easier to set it on the floor and scale it up and down. So I'll go ahead into Front View and just hit GZ1 to move it one unit up, and now it's sitting directly on the floor. But it's still right in the middle of our X and Y axes, so it didn't really change anything for our mirror modifier, unless of course we mirror along the Z, which in this case we don't need to. So let's hit Tab to go back into edit mode, and the only other thing that I want to mention about the mirror modifier is that if we select a vertex that's right along the edge of the mirror, and hit G and move it around, it's a bit hard to see there, so I'll tilt my view. But if I move this a bit, we can create little gaps accidentally or do some overlapping, which we usually don't want. So what I'll do is turn on this option called clipping over in the mirror modifier, and that way when I move this vertex, I can't move it away from that center line. So the clipping option just helps prevent accidental overlapping or holes. Okay, so we have our two horizontal edge loops here, but let's create some vertical edge loops to section off this top corner. So I'll hit Ctrl-R, left-click to confirm, slide this over a bit, and left-click to confirm. I'll do that same thing on the front, Ctrl-R, left-click, drag it over, and left-click again to confirm. Now I'd like all of these faces to be perfectly square, and so one way that we can accomplish that is with snapping. Right now our snapping is set to increment snapping, which means that we can move by even increments. But if I go to front view by pressing 1 on my number pad, and then I'll go to wireframe view so that this is easier to see right next to the grid. If I turn on snapping here and hit G, I can move this by even increments, but I'd really like it to snap to the grid itself. So I'll switch from increment snapping to grid snapping, and now I can snap exactly to the grid, though I'm going to want to constrain it to an axis. So when I hit G, I'll also hit X to constrain it to the X-axis, and now I can line it up perfectly with one of these squares. I don't know how well it comes across in the video, but I'm going to snap it to exactly 4 of these squares from the side of the cube. Then I can Alt-select this edge loop that goes down and along here. Again, Alt-left-click to select an edge loop, and then hit G and Z to grab along the Z-axis and snap it to exactly 4 squares down from the top. And then I'll hit 3 to go to side view, Alt-select this edge loop that goes all the way around, this time G and then Y, and snap it to 4 squares again. Then I'll go ahead and turn off snapping for now. All right, then I'll also hit Alt-A to deselect everything, switch back over to solid view, and we're almost ready to make our cuts. But one thing that I want to do is make more of an interesting shape for the handle, which is going to be under this edge that runs right in the middle here. So to give it a diagonal cut, what I'll do is add one more edge loop here right in the middle, enter to confirm, and then I'll switch to edge select mode by hitting 2 on the top row number keys and selecting this edge right in the middle. And then just to make it easier, I'll switch over to my move tool and move this up. That way, when we cut this section out, we'll get a nice 45-ish degree angle. Though I do want it to jut in a little bit straight before it goes into that angle. So I'll actually go ahead and undo that really quick and put in one more edge loop right here, right in the middle between the other two. And then I can take this edge and then move that up. If you want to picture in your mind what this handle is going to look like a little bit better, we can add in another edge loop here at the bottom. And since it's not flat, what we can do is after we've left clicked to confirm the number of edge loops and we're still sliding with our mouse, we can hit E on our keyboard to make it even to one side or the other. So if you hit E again, it'll flip and make it even with the other side. But if I hit E again, it'll toggle back down to this side, which in this case is completely flat. So I'll move it to about there, and then I'll hit 3 to go to face select mode. And these 3 faces are what's going to make up our handle. This middle section is going to appear quite long when we mirror it over to the other side. So what I'll do is I'll Alt left click to select this edge loop that defines the top of that corner and just move it in closer to the center line. If you want to work in even increments, one thing that you might find helpful is viewport overlays. So if we go to our edit mode overlays here, we can turn on face angle. So if we wanted to make this a 45-degree angle, I could go into side view here by hitting 3 on my number pad. And then as I move this along the y-axis, you'll notice that this number, which is going to appear right there, will move closer or farther away from 45 degrees as we move that. Now, I don't really need it to be 45 degrees at all, so I'm not too worried about that. But if we did want to, say, for example, match the length of this edge, we could also switch from face angle to edge length and select that edge, and then Alt select this edge loop and try to match that. So these overlays can be really helpful, but in this case, we're not making anything super precise, so I'll go ahead and eyeball it. Okay, so the first step was creating all the loop cuts that are going to help us define the panel cuts. But now that we have all these in place, we can actually make those panel cuts, and the shapes will really start to pop out at us. So let's just select all these edges that we want to turn into a cut. First, I'll Alt select this edge loop that runs along the top here, and then I'll Alt Shift select the loop right below it, and then I'll Alt Shift select the loop that goes to the right of our corner, and Alt Shift select the loop that goes to the left of our corner. Next, we can deselect the edges that we don't want to be part of the cut. So I'll Shift left click on both of these edges here so that we have a panel that wraps all the way around uninterrupted. And then up at the top, I'll Shift deselect all of those edges such that it just makes a cube with that corner. And I'll do the same thing here at the bottom. I'll deselect those. And you can also hit B to box select and then middle mouse click and drag to deselect if you want. All right. But now that we have all of these edges selected, we need to give them some thickness so that we can extrude them into the mesh. To give them thickness, we can use the bevel tool. So I'll hit Control B to start a bevel and then drag my mouse away from the center of the operation. Then I'll left click to confirm And if you want to set it to some exact amount, then we could go over to the redo panel in the bottom left. And in this case, I'll set it over to 0.02, though it doesn't really matter too much. Now to extrude these into the mesh, if we just hit E to extrude, then it'll just go in one direction, but it won't really work for the sides or the top or the bottom or anything like that. So what we really want to do is extrude along normals. We can either get to that by left-clicking over in the toolbar, left-click and holding on the Extrude Region tool, and switching over to the Extrude Along Normals tool, and drag out from there, or drag in from there. Or we could also get to that in any tool, just by hitting Alt-E and choosing Extrude Faces Along Normals. Then I can push these in a bit, just like so. Now this isn't going to be exactly straight. If I go over to wireframe view and then go to top view, you can see that things are a little bit crooked here. So I'll go to that redo panel and just turn on offset even, and that'll straighten everything out, at least the parts that are selected. The bevel definitely pushed these vertices away from some of these other vertices, and so some of our connecting edges aren't straight anymore. And this is going to give us a little bit of trouble later, so we may as well fix it now. What I'll do is go to vertex select mode here, and just select all of these vertices that we want to align with this new vertex that we created after the bevel, and go over to our snapping menu, turn on snapping, and switch over to vertex snapping. With that, we can move these vertices along the x-axis and hover our mouse over the vertex that we want to snap to. Make sure you box select by left-clicking and dragging or using the B to box select hotkey, because otherwise if you take one of these vertices and then try to move it, it's not going to select all the way through the mesh, and you'll miss one vertex at the top or the bottom. So you want to box select, and that way you select both vertices all the way through the mesh. All right, then I'll move this one along the y-axis. Again, start by dragging on the y-axis and then moving my mouse over to the vertex that I want to snap to. Okay, let's look at this in front view. Everything looks straight there. I'll look at it in side view, and that also looks pretty good. So I'll switch back to solid view here and turn off snapping. For this next part, let's inset the handle. I think I want it to be a little bit taller though, so I'll Alt select this edge loop that runs along the bottom of it and drag this down just slightly along the Z-axis. Then I can select all of the faces that I want to make up the handle by going to face select mode and selecting these three faces. Then I'll hit I to inset and drag my mouse in and left click to confirm. The problem here is that I want the inset to run all the way through the mirror and not stop at the edge of the mirror, because if I were to extrude this now, I'd get two distinct sections where I want it to just be one piece all the way through the mirror modifier. So to fix that, I'll just turn off boundary over in the redo panel, and that'll allow it to extend all the way through that boundary edge. Next, I'll just leave these faces selected and then hit E to extrude and move that back along the x-axis. That works well, but you can see that we now have a face that runs all the way through the center of our mirror line. So we definitely want to get rid of these faces. To do that, I'll just select the ones that are inside those panel cuts, hit delete and faces. I'll do the same thing on this side here. I'll select these, delete and faces. That must have happened when we extruded those panel lines without having clipping enabled. I thought I remembered enabling that earlier, but just to show you here, with that off, and we extrude something right along that center line, we'll get that face in the middle. But if I go ahead and turn on clipping and extrude that back, then we won't get that unwanted face. So I'll just leave clipping enabled from now on. To make it so that this handle isn't entirely flat and boring, what I'll do is go to edge select mode by hitting 2 on the top row of my number keys and selecting these three edges that create the bottom back of it and pulling them up along the Z-axis to create a slope. And this is a little bit shallow, so I'll go to face select mode, select the three faces that make up the back of the handle, and move those in along the x-axis just a little bit more. And then go back to selecting these edges and moving them up just a little bit. All right, I do like that slope, but I think the handle could be a little bit taller, so I'll go to wireframe view, go to front view, and vertex select by pressing 1 on the top row of number keys and selecting all of the vertices that make up the bottom of that handle and moving those down just a bit. We can also see that in side view. I'll hit Z and switch to solid view, and I think that looks a bit better. All right, now when we are in side view, it's a little bit hard to see the details here, So what I'll do is go to the top right of the 3D view header, head to the viewport shading popover, and turn on cavity. Then I'll switch the type from screen to world, and now I can actually see this handle even when I'm in side view. So my details are now a little bit more clear. Now, you could argue that the next most important detail is the panel that goes all the way around the top and creates this sort of latch. But both that and the box have this bevel to it, and we may as well make that bevel one time and then extract that latch later. So let's go ahead and create that bevel. I'll do that all the way along the top front edge by going to Edge Select Mode and Alt left clicking to select that edge loop. Then to bevel it, I just need to hit Ctrl B and move my mouse away from the center of the operation. I'll make a smaller bevel at first at about 0.1 meters, which is going to be the bevel for the cubes on the corners, but then I want the bevel to be a bit wider here towards the center. So what I'll do is, instead of trying to bevel again or anything like that, I'll just take these edges that make up that center there and pull these in along the y-axis. Then I'll take these two edges that make up the bottom of that bevel and move them down along the z-axis. And if I go to side view and wireframe view, then I can also try to match that angle a bit. Okay, that looks about right. So I'll switch back to solid view. Now to start that latch detail, I'll hit Ctrl R and add another edge loop, and add an edge loop right down the middle of that front face. I'll hit Enter to confirm without moving it at all. And then instead of extruding out from these faces, because now we have these panel gaps to contend with, and that would get a little bit confusing, what I'll instead do is hit 3 to go to face select mode and select just these 3 faces here on the front that define the main angle of it. And then I'll hit Shift D to duplicate them, left click to confirm. So it looks like nothing's changed, but they're just laying directly on top of the other faces. And then I'll hit P and separate by selection. Or you could also go to Mesh, Separate, and by selection. What that's done is make it a new object. So we can tab to go to Object Mode and select these two separately. It would be a good thing to name them, so I'll rename the cube to Crate, and the second object as Crate Latch. Then I'll hit Tab to go into Edit Mode on this new object, and go to Edge Select Mode, select this top edge, and just pull that in along the y-axis. Since we have clipping enabled over in the mirror modifier, I'm not going to be able to pull it past that center line. Then I'll take this bottom edge and move that down along the z-axis until it's just partway through this bottom panel. Then I can hit A to select everything here and extrude it along the normals just like we did with the panel gaps, but this time I'll extrude it out. I'll hit Alt E and choose Extrude Faces along normals. Push those out just a little bit, let's say to 0.1 meters. And we can also choose offset even, though in this case it shouldn't make too much difference. And maybe that is a little bit thick, so maybe I'll pull this down to about 0.05. Okay, now just to finish off this detail and make it a bit more interesting, let's take this bottom edge here, this bottom corner, and hit Ctrl B to bevel. I'll bevel that just a bit, and then I'd like to create a detail that connects this top panel to this bottom panel. So I'm going to inset in both of these areas and extrude it backwards, and then pull out a detail and connect it vertically. So first we just need to create some loop cuts that go through this area. But now I can't do that because after I beveled, I now have an n-gon as this face, which is a face that has more than 4 sides. And we can't create loop cuts that go through n-gons. So what I need to do is just make it so that this is now a quad. Easy enough, we can take our knife tool to create a cut that goes from this vertex towards the center. To get to that, we can hit K or use the knife tool over in the toolbar. I'll just use the K hotkey, hover over this top vertex of the bottom right corner, left click to start the cut, move the mouse over to the center, and then I can left click on this center line here and hit enter to confirm. Now I'd like this to be perfectly straight, so I'll go to vertex select mode and select that vertex. And since we have vertex snapping selected in our snapping popover, I can now move this along the z-axis, and to temporarily enable snapping, I can hold down Control and hover over that vertex on the right. So even though snapping is not enabled, I can always toggle that by holding down Control when I'm moving something. But now that this n-gon has been turned into quads, I can now hit Control R and add a loop cut right through it. So I'll hit Control R And then before I left click to confirm, I'll scroll up on my mouse wheel to make 2 loop cuts, and then I'll left click to confirm, and then to make them even with that bottom edge, which is already perfectly flat, I'll hit E for even. And if that doesn't do it, you can hit E again to toggle between the top and the bottom, but it looks like that works perfectly fine. And then I'll left click to place these right in the middle of this panel here. And then to make it thinner, I'll just hit S and Z. Okay, that looks good. I'll place that so that it's just about right in the middle of that panel. And then I want to make something of similar size here at the bottom. So again, I'll hit Control R, and this time I'll just do it one at a time. Control R and Control R. Though I'd like the spacing to be a little bit more similar to what it is here at the top. So I'll Alt left click to select this edge loop here at the top and move it so that the spacing is roughly the same as the distance between the cut and this bottom edge loop here, about the same. And then I'll hit Z to go to wireframe view and select all of these bottom vertices, and then hit Z again to go to solid view and drag this down so that this new face that we just created, which we're going to inset, is about the same width as this top one. It doesn't have to be exact, but we can be close enough. Now let's take these faces, this face and that one, hit I to inset. If boundary is enabled, then hit B to turn it off so that the cut goes all the way through the mirror, and just inset that a bit like so. And then to push this into the mesh, we can just use E to extrude and go along the Y-axis like so until it's just about to cut through the mesh, but not quite. So just about there. And then what we can also do to create a piece that juts out and connects these areas, I'll hit I to inset one more time, just like so, and then E to extrude to pull this outwards until it's jutting out of the mesh just a little bit. E to extrude again, and that way we have this edge loop that runs all the way around on both sides, and both of these sides line up exactly already. And then we can take both of these faces and bridge them. What this tool does is really, really helpful. So let's go to the right-click context menu and choose Bridge Faces. All right, that worked out pretty well. I think it is a bit thick though, so to fix that we can go to Front View by hitting 1 on the number pad, hitting 1 on the top row of number keys to go to Vertex Select Mode, switching over to Wireframe View, or into X-Ray, either way. I'm just so used to working in Wireframe View, but you can also do X-Ray. And then box selecting all of these vertices here, going back to Solid View, and just moving this in a little bit along the X-axis. Okay, I think that's enough for the latch, so I'll hit Tab to go to Object Mode. And lastly, let's make the ridges that go along the top and the bottom. To do that, I'll select the main crate and hit Tab to go into Edit Mode. And we could add it on this object here, just by adding a whole bunch of edge loops. But the problem is, if we do that, those edge loops run all the way around the model, and it could create quite a headache. So there are a couple solutions here. One, we could extract this part of the model and separate it out like we did with the latch, or we could also create n-gons and stop the loops right along the edge there so that it doesn't pass all the way through the rest of the model. I'd like to be careful about using n-gons though, especially in a beginner tutorial, so let's go ahead and just extract these areas. Though first we can do a little inset to make sure we have the right areas selected, and then pull them out into a separate object. So first let's select all the faces that we want to create bumpers for. It looks like these faces up here are already perfectly fine. I'll hit 3 to go to Face Select Mode. So we want this section here to have bumpers, and this section here, and this section here, though this is going to run into the latch. So let's go to Edge Select Mode, and then Alt left click to select this edge loop that goes all the way around. But you'll notice that it ends right here, where we hit a vertex that has 5 vertices connected to it rather than 4, and it doesn't know whether to go up in this direction or over in this direction. So let's just Alt Shift left click to select both of these edge loops. And now we've selected that entire edge, and I can pull that down to safely below the latch. All right, with that, then we can hit 3 to go back to Face Select Mode, left click and drag to select all of those faces there, Shift left click and drag to add to that selection. Let's do these as well. And now let's inset these faces a bit to give the detail a bit of padding. So I'll hit I to inset, and left click to confirm. And similar to what we did with the latch, I'll go to Mesh, Separate, and choose Selection. That's going to create a new object out of that selection and extract it from this mesh. So then I'll hit Tab to go into Object Mode, select that new object, and in the viewport I can hit F2 to rename this to Crate Bumpers, hit Enter to confirm that, and then hit Tab to jump into Edit Mode. Now I'd like to create a bunch of evenly spaced cuts here, but if I were to add edge loops here, they're going to run into our existing edge loops, which might not be so perfectly spaced. So I can get rid of all these edge loops just by Alt left clicking them. Let's go to Edge Select Mode first by hitting 2 on the top row of number keys, and then Alt Shift left clicking to select all of these edge loops. Alt Shift, just anything that's not part of the boundary. And then delete, and this time we can go down to edge loops. Then we can create our new cuts. I'll hit Control R and create a bunch of vertical cuts, left click to confirm the number of cuts, and left click again immediately without moving it to confirm the final result. And it looks like we made about 10 cuts here, which works great for me. And then let's also go ahead and do that same thing over here on the bottom right. I'll hit Control R, scroll up on my mouse wheel, left click to confirm, left click again, and jump the number down to 10. I'll do the same thing up here. Control R, scroll up, left click and left click again, switch that to 10, and we're good to go. Now I want to inset all of these strips, but I can't do that all at once. Let's say I select everything with A and then hit I to inset, and yours might look a little bit different depending on what preferences you had set. If you hit I, you'll turn off individual, and if it's not doing anything, then go ahead and press B to turn off boundary here. But let's hit I again to turn on individual, and now you'll see that it splits it from top to bottom as well as from side to side. But I'd really like it to run all the way down vertically and create a strip and not create that separation in the middle. So instead of that, what we have to do is just select every other strip. So I'll just hold Shift and left click and drag these strips like so. Shift, left click and drag, just select every other. Just like that. And then once we do that, then we can hit I to inset, hit I to turn individual off. Again, if you forget any of these hotkeys, they're down in the status bar. And let's inset them just a little bit, and then left click to confirm. I'll set it to, let's say, 0.015. That way we can set the other ones to the exact same value as well, 0.015. So then I'll just left click and shift left click to select all of these others. And if this gizmo is getting in the way, we can switch over to our selection tool, shift, left click and drag. Select all of these down here. And again, hit I to inset, left click to confirm, and then set the thickness to 0.015. Okay, now we can select all of the middles of all of those. This is kind of the tedious part of modeling, is mostly just selection. Control Z if you accidentally mess up like that. And there's often ways that you can speed things up a little bit, but in this case, I think this is not too much to select. So once you have all of the centers of those selected, then we can use our extrude along normals again, Alt-E, extrude faces along normals, and just push those in. Okay, left click to confirm, and we're looking good. I'll switch to object mode here and go back to the main crate, and as the very last detail, what I'll do is hit tab to go into edit mode, select this bottom corner, and then hit Control B to bevel, which won't do anything because it's just a single vertex, but then I can hit V and enable vertex beveling, and bevel that vertex to make a nice triangle. If you want to jump right into beveling a vertex, you can always hit Control Shift B, and that'll jump you into vertex beveling, but sometimes it's just easier to remember Control B to bevel anything, and then V to toggle vertex once you're in bevel mode. Okay, with that, just as a little cherry on top, what I'll do is add a bevel modifier to just ever so slightly bevel all of the tiny edges here. So I'll add modifier, go down to generate, and choose bevel. Now, if you don't see anything happen, it's because you probably have two vertices that are way too close to each other somehow. And so under geometry, you're going to want to turn off clamp overlap. Now, this is going to make everything explode, but it also won't clamp your bevel. So let's just take our amount, hold shift as we're dragging to go down in smaller increments, and just turn this into a really small bevel. Then we can take our other objects. I'll shift select them and then shift select our crate last. Go down to the drop-down menu under the modifier options and choose copy to selected. Then for our bumps and ridges here, we might want to make this amount a little bit smaller. So I'll select that object and turn down the bevel amount just like so. Then once you've done that, then you've officially completed the Sci-Fi crate. Now, before you move on to the next lesson, what I'd really like you to do is spend a little bit of time and add a couple of your own details as well. Once you have all of these panel cuts, it's pretty easy to just tab into edit mode, find some shape that you like or create a new shape, and create an inset and then an extrusion, and just go from there. So you could create some new panel lines or some new extrusions or some new insets, but I just want you to do something interesting to this Sci-Fi box so that it's not exactly the same as the end of this tutorial. Once you do that, I'd really like to see the result. So take a screenshot or go to View and Viewport Render Image and save this image out. Then you can go over to cgcookie.com and click on the Community tab and go to Create New Topic and make a new forum thread where you can paste your modeling progress, either throughout the course or as you continue learning. A lot of people call these polybooks, so you could call it, for me, I'd call it Jonathan's Polybook, and then I'd upload that picture of the crate as well as maybe the snowman from the previous course, and post your modeling journey here so that we can see how it's going for you and give you some encouragement. But that's it for this lesson, and in the next few lessons, we'll take a look at some new modeling tools.